but a morning to yes. You are listening to the Monsters and Friends podcast. This is a podcast dedicated to the cryptids, legends, and lores that might not get the same kind of attention as their larger-than-life counterparts. Sorry if I alienated anyone of actual Irish descent, but I am your host, Michael Patrick, and I am, in fact, Irish. But, no, not like real Irish, but I'm the kind of Irish that most Americans like to be. But this week is a very, very special week here on the Monsters and Friends podcast. Next to Christmas, this is absolutely my favorite holiday. One of the biggest reasons is my mom absolutely adored St. Patrick's Day. So St. Patrick's Day is always a little bit rough for me. I try not to be too real on this podcast, but I lost my mom a number of years ago, and this holiday was one that she absolutely adored. So I always get a bit melancholy around St. Patrick's Day. However, I know for a fact that if she listened to this and she heard me being all sad about it, she'd probably either take off her shoe or grab a wooden spoon and whack me with it. So instead, we are going to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, and today, this afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are when you are listening, we're doing something very special. So we're going to go a little BuzzFeed cliche, and we're not going to highlight just one thing. We are going to highlight 3 of them. What? Did I go crazy? Absolutely. But you know what? That doesn't really matter to me in this case. However, methinks this could be very fun. And as per BuzzFeed rules, when doing multiple things, you have to do it in list form. So the difference is I'll try to breathe in this video while talking, unlike those BuzzFeed videos where they just talk like this and then they go really, really fast. And also, you know what? By the way, too, please, BuzzFeed, don't sue me. I have no money. So, but before we get into that, there's a pretty serious thing that I was asked to address on the podcast. Now, I hate to serious it up again, but recently I was listening to another amazing podcast, and that one's called Graveyard Tales. So, in this week's episode of their show, they covered the Snallygaster. At one point, gosh, man, this is really hard. One of their hosts, Adam, I believe it was, questioned the validity of the creature, saying that perhaps it was created to keep people away from moonshine stills. Well, unfortunately, there seems to be an issue here. I brought attention to it earlier, and, oh boy. I'm being beckoned to turn over the mic, so, you know what? I'm sorry, Adam.
You should be sorry,
hold on.
This week, I was practicing for an upcoming euchre tournament with Snally when I heard that nonsense that you were listening to. Whatever.
It's
way,
not nonsense.
They insulted Snally. So guess what? I invited her here to the cabin to clear the air.
Oh, good. Okay.
You know what, Michael? Well, I do not mean to be a grumpy Gus in this situation and come into your house and just be angry, but I just heard some sort of nonsense going on here, and I feel that I have to clear the air. Look, some people for hundreds of years have said that my family ain't real. Well, here I am. I ain't no phony, y'all. I'm a real deal Holyfield. And I am here to tell Mr. Adam that anytime he wants me in the show, sweetie, y'all just gotta ask. Yeah, you know what? Well, my ancestors, they used to guard those shiner stills, but times have changed, pal. We're just members of the cryptid community like anyone else, and I would love an apology for even suggesting that perhaps I'm not a real thing. Do you understand how hard it is to get people to believe in you when you have a radio man saying other things? Do you? Well, dearie me, see, now I'm getting all flustered. Michael, I appreciate what you do, but make sure that you keep our feelings in mind, too. We are real things, sir. Now, Barry and I is trying to get our euchre on so we can win this here tournament. We playing against the Jersey Devil and the Bigfoot and the Sheep Squatch and all that nonsense. But you know what? That's all I gotta say. So, Mr. Big Radio Man over there with the graveyard house thing, sir, you better watch yourself. Bye.
Way to go, Chase.
Okay. Well, I don't know what to say. Well, alrighty. Well, you know what? I guess we'll just move right along after that. And I don't even know. Anyway, as I said, this week we are celebrating St. Patrick's Day. We are going to highlight 3 separate Irish cryptids, legends, and a bit of lore that we love and we really want to share with all of you. So, let's jump right into it. We're deviating a little bit this week and moving a tiny bit away from Old Reliable, which is usually just talking about cryptids. This week, we're going to sprinkle in some legends and lore as well. And we're going to start right off the bat with our first one. Through the course of St. Patrick's Day, my 2 youngest daughters are going to spend the day hunting for the legendary leprechaun. He always shows up in the house and he does some crazy stuff. Somehow the toilet water always turns green. Chocolate gold coins that may or may not be left over from Halloween end up in the randomest of places like inside shoes. And of course, all the girls' dress-up stuff somehow gets strewn about their room because, honestly, what self-respecting leprechaun doesn't want to dress up like a wench? They love it, though. So they squeal and they run and they build these little leprechaun traps. Well, Dad's not so interested in the leprechaun as he is in the leprechaun's cousin. Let me introduce you to the Cluricon. Why do I want to see the Cluricon instead? Well, there are those that believe that the Cluricon isn't a separate entity, but rather simply a leprechaun on a bit of a drinking bender, and I can get down with that. Instead of chocolate coins, I really hope next year he hides some Guinness around and I can go ahead and look for it this time. I also want to apologize for probably butchering what this little fellow is called, so hopefully if I leave out some booze tonight, we'll be all set. But let me tell you a little bit more about our new friend here. We are fully aware of what a leprechaun looks like, right? Small, wears green, and he hops around hiding gold and fixing your shoes and stuff. He's a cobbler. Well, the Cluricon is very, very far from that. He just described as measuring about 6 inches of height. He has a face like a withered apple. He has twinkling eyes and a nose that's different shades of red and purple due to his love for heavy drinking. When you see him, you'll know him by his red nightcap, short leather apron, light blue stockings, and dark shoes with large silver buckles. Well, at least that's how Thomas Crofton Crocker described the little fella. Most of their tales describe a creature quite similar as well. The Cluricon is known to be a very, very surly little fellow, unlike his happy-go-lucky cousin the leprechaun. What does a Cluricon do in its free time, you ask? Well, let me tell you. A favorite pastime of the Cluricon is to terrorize farmers all throughout the Irish countryside. They absolutely adore a good ride on the back of a sheep or a dog, and if you're ever in Ireland and you hear a sheep losing its mind, take a peek because this little fella is probably hitching a ride on its back, having one heck of a time. But make sure that you are weary if you happen to catch a glimpse of this fella. He'll quickly talk his way into your home and terrorize you. He'll steal whatever isn't nailed down and drink whatever you have in your house, tearing up everything along the way. It's pretty easy to keep these little drunkards happy, though. All you have to do is keep them fed, drunk, and content. There was a family in Cork County, Ireland, that did the opposite of that, though. They used to feed a Cluricon every night and leave a little nightcap for him. Well, one night the cook didn't leave what the creature wanted, and the Cluricon dragged her downstairs and proceeded to cause all sorts of havoc. In response, the cook and her husband had heard that if she had moved across the stream, the Cluricon wouldn't be able to follow. They packed up everything in their home, including the wine barrels, but the Cluricon was pretty smart and he knew what was happening. They're known to be quite intelligent, so this was a little tricky. What he had ended up doing was he wedged himself between two barrels, and when the lady of the house saw this, he said he was ready to move when she noticed the little fella. So, exhausted by this, the woman simply decided to unpack and stay where she was because she assumed that this small, drunken beast would just simply be able to move with her when, in fact, he actually wouldn't be able to. So, she was outwitted by a tiny, drunken fella. The woman of the house ended up passing on, of course, but the rumor is that the Cluricon still calls the wine cellar in this house its home, forever haunting who lives there. I mean, talk about insanity. But let's review, okay? So to keep a Cluricon happy, simply leave it some booze and some food, and poof, there you go. Just kind of like a college kid. Our next is a fairly interesting creature. Of course, we're talking about the puka. You know who he is, right? Well, who doesn't? You know what? Actually, I had no idea. But he's really, really interesting. Let's start what I think is the most interesting part. The puka is a shape-shifting creature that is known to take the form of a horse, a rabbit, a goat, a dog, and sometimes a cat. Occasionally, the puka can even take the form of a human. But there's a little bit of an issue with that one. Have you ever seen the movie Men in Black when the dude, the cockroach guy, puts on the Vincent D'Onofrio suit? It's similar to that, right? Usually when it turns into a human, it can't quite muster up all the oomph that it needs to fully form itself. It still has some semblance of its original animal form, so there's been versions when a puka turns into a human inside of someone's home, but it wasn't able to shake its long, thick tail or pointy, hairy ears, or in some cases, weird animal-like legs. So I can't imagine that you wouldn't know that you're not dealing with a person when you're talking to grandma and suddenly you notice that her kneecaps are bent the wrong way. But, I digress. I mean, sometimes I guess grandmas can be horse creatures. But more often than not, if you see a puka, it's in the form of a large black horse. The puka also comes with other fairly large question marks surrounding it. A pretty big one is whether or not the puka is a good creature or a bad creature. I've seen accounts where they've described this as being and I quote, wicked-minded, black-looking, bad thing. Sometimes they come in the form of a dark, wild colt. They have chains dangling from their mouths, and they did a really good job of beating up unweary travelers. They really like causing mischief as well, because, well, what Irish legend or lore actually doesn't, right? Occasionally, they'd find a traveler on the road, and they'd offer them a ride. You see a horse, and you say, hey, let me take you up on that. Welp, instead of just a nice, smooth trot through the countryside, they'd give them a wicked, bucking ride from hell and generally would then drop them off in the same place that they picked them up from, getting them literally nowhere. Isn't that awesome? Not to mention that I've seen some stories in which they've been referred to as bloodthirsty creatures that like to hunt down people and eat them. Good times. But it's not all bad. It's also been reported by, other people that haven't been eaten by these creatures, that they're not all bad. They're actually known sometimes to be quite nice and very helpful to farmers. There's a specific tale of a young man named Patrick. I can already